Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, it has been quite a time since I've made a video. I hope all of you are doing well as I am these days. So why I haven't made a video in a while? Well, I've been working full time plus doing a bunch of other stuff, and I just really ain't had time to jump in on any of the topics that I normally cover in any serious amount. But one thing came across my desk about 3 months ago, and I thought about it a little bit, and that came from EconJohn, who many of you may know is one of the individuals that I interviewed right before I stopped doing videos. And I think EconJohn is one of the most brilliant health economists out there right now. But he made a video on equilibrium and why it matters in economics. And so some of the things that I'm going to say in here are directly symmetrical with what he's going to say. But there's also something I want to add to it. And so something to think about here. All right, there are three major ways to discuss economic analytics. All right, the first is the balance. And this is to be out of balance and then back to balance. This is very similar to equilibrium, but it's not the same. And then we have models of equilibrium. These are models to equilibrium, disequilibrium, back to equilibrium. And the third, and the one that a lot of people aren't discussing very often, is information processing. So you have information processing, then a shock, then you have a new mode of information processing. And then the question becomes how are they different at like an abstract level? If we look at, just a basic supply and demand model, fundamentally this relies on either a rebalance or a new equilibrium. And what I mean by that, for example, you have like a shock to price that shifts demand curves, and a shift of individual demand curves leads to an aggregate demand curve shift. But what happens is a new equilibrium, or if it's like a short run shock, it's a return to the old balance. And though the new balance is likely due to some constant increasing variety or complex, that's why we're probably going to go to a new equilibrium. But that's not always the case. And then we have this ever increasing complexity that happens, and it's really hard to understand what's going on in the complexity when it comes to these equilibrium models, especially if you look at innovation. There is not a return to balance in innovation. There is no equilibrium, or there's no equilibration, because there's no way that it can equilibrate, roughly speaking. But the information being processed has changed, and the mode or the media is different. For example, VHS to DVDs. Or another way to look at it is we got Blockbuster to Netflix through the mail, and then Netflix streaming. We can see that there is a fundamental change in the information process in the economic system. So how has this supposed shift impacted economics? First, we've got people like Steve Keen that think modern economics have yet to deal with complex systems. I disagree, but we'll get to that. Yet, he hasn't either. His insistence on disequilibrium analysis, as we discussed earlier, leaves out important fundamental properties of the economic system of information process changing, and they can change in non-stochastic and stochastic equilibrium states. And so you can think of this as a stable versus an unstable equilibrium, like a sink or a source in differential equations. But that goes back to the point here. Why do economists focus on the equilibrium? Well, with an equilibrium, we have this defined function, which allows us to see how it changes with respect to variables and parameters in the model. And by using comparative statics, something that EconJohn talked about, we can see the directional effects of each variable and their relative magnitude. Therefore, we can use this to compare and test our economic models, and we have this theoretical causal relationship grounding our observations in a way that we can test hypotheses. So by doing this equilibrium analysis, we're making economics, this wildly complex system, into something scientific. And the way I usually think about explaining this to people is we're going to look at the work of Schumpeter, right? So we have, say, a monopolistic equilibrium. Suppose you have a system, say a video rental company, and over time the competition is limited by internal and external forces. Internal forces would be like mimetic isomorphism, which means this company is doing better than the rest, so everybody kind of copies it. And then you have external forces, which is like coercive isomorphism. That's regulation from the government and stuff like that. And so isomorphism is essentially the statement that all the differentiated companies start becoming more and more alike over time, moving into one or two, so we can be a monopoly or an oligopoly. And that happens over time. So this general market equilibrium becomes this stultifying nature that leads to innovation in order to overcome the market structure. Now, Keene may state that this is a disequilibrium because there's not a balance, but I'm going to tell you that I disagree. Isomorphism is a movement to or at an equilibrium. Whether the equilibrium is balanced is of no immediate concern. You can think of the Volterra equations, predator and prey models, right? It doesn't have to be a strict static equilibrium. There can be a fluctuation. And that's what I'm getting at, because the balance between the two is offset by the preferences in real space, not in abstract, meaning I may demand more movies at this store or cheaper prices, but I nor the firm impact all of that. And I know some people will say monopolies can impact prices. Yeah, but I can't change my ability to buy in the immediate short term. It relies on other systems, right? So to get movies, it has to be from the movie system. So my small system is in equilibrium or is an expectation of an equilibrium. And so this outlines one of the big issues in economics. What is equilibrium? It's usually stated as market clearing prices, where we have demand equal to supply. However, we know this can't actually happen in the real world because supply is not fixed to demand, because demand is an abstraction of what people are able to do. And that's what I mean by the real space to the abstract space. However, prices do clear markets by outcome as things are purchased. So then what? Anyways, we can look at disequilibrium analysis, right? The continual shortages in supply and demand can obviously spur innovation, which again leads to more isomorphism. But why? The main reasoning for this is that the economic system is operationally closed but functionally open, meaning it generates itself and produces its own structures. Thus, as the complexity increases, the information must also increase until all of the information is consumed. And we can think about this with a quick little quip, right? So let's say you have this fact and you're going to tell your friend this fact. And they don't know it because it's novel. So boom, you've given them the information. That fact has been generated to them. What happens then is you're going to tell them again and 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 again. Two things are going to happen. All right. The first thing that's going to happen is the meaning of what you're saying hasn't changed, but the information is now gone because it's no longer novel. So there's no more transferring of information. It's already there. Even though the meaning isn't changed, the information is done up with. The second, your friend will tell you to shut the hell up. So we're going to wrap this up, because when I get into the information processing part of economics, this is going to be something that's going to be a long and drawn out idea. The main purpose of coming up with this video and discussing this was kind of validating what EconJohn was saying, and also taking that complexity dynamic systems attack on Steve Keene, because he keeps pushing this dynamic systems. But he pushes complex adaptive systems, which would work if it was an open system, but the economy is not an open system. It is a closed system. It has to be by nature. And you're thinking, why would it be that way? Well, nothing happens in the economic system that happens outside of the economic system, right? So some people can say that the political realm will impact the economic system. No, it doesn't. It may impact the totality of all the systems, but it has perturbations, right? So when regulation comes, that doesn't change the fact that the structures of the economic system are themselves building on top of themselves, right? You're going to buy stuff. You're going to go out and innovate and do all of these things regardless of whatever type of economic system you can think of. And this is one of those things about, well, how did the Russians have all of this technology and manage to do all of this with a really, really, really bad economic system? And that's because the economic system, even if it is structurally coupled along all of the lines to the political system, it still has its own autopoietic or recursive behavior. You can change its path alignment, stuff like that. Like, so initial conditions and differential equations can have wildly different results. That's true of economics. But that doesn't mean that the recursive behavior of the economy as it reproduces itself, right, is changed, because it's not changed. It's following its own path because it's reproducing what it wants and how it wants it. And the key here to think about that is that it's closed. Some of the arguments from complex adaptive systems don't actually work. And this is where communication really, really comes in, because if you look at the work of Niklas Luhmann and also Loet Ladesdorff in his triple helix and I think quad helix work that's going on right now in innovation studies really goes into this very deeply. And that's something that I'm going to open up next, is really getting to the communication paradigm shift in economics. And will or will it not have a lasting impact is up in the air. I love the communication paradigm shift. I loved it when it happened in sociology, and I've loved it when it happened, I guess you could say, partially in theology, which is something I may or may not touch on. But it's important to understand what's going on in this communication paradigm shift, and how it's going to interact with some of the cool stuff that's happening in economics when it comes to this equilibrium versus this disequilibrium debate. Because again, if we wanted to maintain this scientific endeavor of economics, you're going to have those equilibrium states to test with. But maybe those equilibrium states don't necessarily have to be about supply and demand. They can also be about information. And that also implies that the evolution of the economy into this information-based economy is also rather important for how it's going to impact models in the future. Anyway, I hope that's been a brief introduction in this, and I hope it was kind of fun. Have a good one.